So let's talk about the European Super League, guys. It's something that has come about kind of all of a sudden, or something that you could argue that's been in the works for a long, long time, but something that got announced kind of all of a sudden and has taken the absolute world by storm. Not only the footballing and sports media, but also traditional media as well. And social media has been going crazy about it. And there's been lots of stuff thrown about, lots of opinions, lots of funny memes as well at the same time. But I thought I'd give my opinion on the Super League, what I think maybe some of the positives of it are, because I don't think anyone's really focusing on those, and I think they're important to be noted, right? Because if we really want to make a balanced argument for whether we think this is the right thing for football, we need to understand the positives of doing it rather than just flat out ignoring it and just saying no to it, right? So I'm doing this video as a on the perspective of being a Liverpool fan, someone who's supported the team ever since I could figure out how to watch football and understood it, have bought, tickets to games, bought memberships, bought merchandise, all of that type of stuff, but also someone who has worked in a corporate organization and continues to work in a corporate organization and understands the pressures and desires for more revenue and more profitability, and the pressures and everything that comes with that as well. And I think it's an important part of this puzzle to maintain and to really understand, because it's really changed the way football has been over the past couple of years and will continue, regardless of the Super League or not, play a huge role in how we move forward. So before we go into talking directly about the Super League, let's talk a bit about the history of football over the past 20 or so years, because this is when really arguably the greatest change from a financial and commercial perspective has happened in the Premier League. So let's take it back all the way to the mid-2000s, right, where we had an influx of money, particularly into the Premier League, of foreign investment, which led to obviously then some of the best players in the world, some of the most promising players being attracted to the UK and to the Premier League. And guys, don't get it twisted. Money is a huge factor in attracting and getting people and getting talent to your organization, your club, and it's the same for organizations in real life, and it is the same for football clubs too. Let's not forget that. And obviously that's a reason why a lot of players, a lot of managers, and then obviously a lot of commercial teams were attracted to the Premier League. Now, obviously, with the influx of that money and obviously some of the better players coming here, it meant that certain teams were more competitive and pushed themselves further up the table, and so other teams around them needed to react. And then so we saw the likes in the Premier League of the Manchester Cities, etc., getting foreign investment and growing up from there. Now, there's lots talked about the negative impacts of that in terms of the way clubs have been run. Chelsea is a good example of a club that can, we've got a lot of history now to show that actually it maybe hasn't been run like you would expect a football club to be run with that foreign investment. But then you take the positives of the foreign investment. Manchester City, I think, is a great example of that. Both what they've done on the pitch in terms of turning around the fortunes of a club that kind of was going nowhere, but also what they've done in terms of the training ground complex that they've created, which has allowed the likes of Phil Foden, who's become such a great player for us this season, really progress. And who knows how many more players will come out of that academy and come out of that whole system that's been set up by that foreign investment in Manchester City over the years. So let's not forget that, guys. Let's not forget the positives as a result of the foreign investment. In the 2010s then, or the late 2000s, early 2010s, is when we really saw the introduction and rise of the broadcast deals. Now, as more and more of these players and more of these teams grew, and it grew our stature in the European competitions as well, as you would imagine, with better players making us more competitive on the European as well as domestic stage, led to these huge massive football TV deals with the likes of Sky, with the likes of BT, with the likes of Setanta back in the day, all of those guys, where it was very much not driven even by footballing needs or what by the fans wanted. It was purely driven as a commercial vehicle. It was driven as a way to gain more money for the Premier League, for UEFA, and for the clubs. And that was all driven, right? That was all driven by the same people that are driving this European Super League. It's driven by the media and the broadcasters and the clubs themselves demanding more money for being the clubs and teams that are in demand in terms of a viewing perspective. And so obviously the fans lost out at this stage anyway, and the fans have ultimately been losing out since, right? When it comes to paying for multiple subscriptions for, you know, watching football, watching, just being able to support your team and watch all of your team's games, sometimes even being impossible because of commercial rights, particularly down to international commercial rights. And this has all kind of just been leading up to what we've kind of really seen over the past, I'd say 5 to 6 years, which is the kind of true, real commercialization of football, particularly here in the UK, but definitely across Europe as well. And it's got a bit crazy when you think about it, right? When you think about the fact that Liverpool have a skincare sponsor, for example, you know, it gets to the stage where you think, what is the purpose of all of this? Why does this all exist? And the reason it all exists, guys, for those of you guys, let's not beat around the bush here. The reason it exists is to make the club money, and it's not to it's to make the owners money as well. Let's be clear on that, right? It's not to make the club money, to invest into stuff. It's to ultimately benefit the shareholders and the owners of those clubs. Now, what I believe is the case, as I just demonstrated there, the Premier League and UEFA has grown to this kind of more commercial nature steadily over the past 20 years. This is not something that's happened overnight. And ultimately, this European Super League, for me, is an admission that football is now seen and will be seen as a commercial entertainment engine rather than a sporting game that is driven by sport and competitiveness. And I think that is the biggest thing, and I think that final admission is what is getting everyone so very emotional, and has led to, you know, all of the outroar and all of the reactions we have seen over the past couple of days. So let's just take for a second the actual facts of what the European Super League are proposing, right? Let's take them on what they're saying at the moment and understand the positives and the benefits of that, right? So there's 12 founding teams across Europe's major leagues at the moment, with an additional 8 teams to be announced and added. The games for this European Super League would be played midweek, exactly like Champions League games are currently played, to allow no disruption and to allow the domestic schedule and domestic fixtures for all of those teams to continue. With 20 teams in total taking part in the competition, only 5 of those will be up for grabs, let's say, and available for teams that can be promoted into it. Now, I think this is where some of the issues start to arise with the European Super League, with the fact that with having so many teams fixed in the league, and so many teams fixed in the league, that based on it doesn't really make sense as to how those teams have come about, and that's led to some very funny things in terms of, particularly in the UK, memes around Arsenal and Tottenham, for example, about how they've made it in, how you have teams such as Manchester City who've never won a European Cup in there. You look at things like AC Milan, who are actually currently generating less revenue than some of the lower Premier League teams like Crystal Palace, for example, and all of these things are just driving people up against the wall about the format, I think, more than anything else. I think the two things that are the one thing that is the biggest problem is the anti-competitiveness, and that's a huge part of sport. And as well as the greed and the commercial side, I think this is one of the biggest problems with the European Super League as well, is that if you have something that is not competitive, if you have an idea where you are a monopoly, you cannot be touched. The precedent that sets for anybody else is that it's them or nothing. And you look at the way we operate as a society, right? Monopolies are not allowed, right? And why should it be allowed in this case, where you have a group of teams who have somehow joined this format because they have money or influence or whatever, and actually they're the only ones that can manage and make decisions about this. And I think that is a real problem, and it's not thinking about how you get somewhere. You know, these clubs didn't start out as successful clubs. You know, when these teams were down in the dumps, for example, when Manchester City were down in the dumps, they wouldn't have been considered as part of this Super League if one was created back then. But now they are, given their current position. You know, football goes around in circles. We've seen it. We've seen it from teams right up the top who have gone all the way down the leagues, and some of them all come all the way back up. And I think that the challenge and real difficulty that I'm struggling with is that they're taking the position or influence or whatever of teams at a particular moment in time, and that may change in the future. As Gary Neville said, Arsenal are shambles at the moment, both on the pitch and off the pitch. Why do they deserve to be in this competition or playing with those teams any more than any of the other teams across all of the major leagues? And I think that anti-competitiveness is one of the things that I think people are struggling with the most, and for me, again, is one of the reasons why I ultimately think the European Super League won't happen, because the clubs themselves and the players themselves want to be competitive. These are competitors that we're talking about, and they will ultimately revolt against this. But we'll talk about what I think happens next towards the end of this video. So let's take it back again to the commercial nature. And sorry guys, this video is a bit kind of here, there, and everywhere, because I'm trying to gather my thoughts. I've got all my notes, but I'm just trying to gather my thoughts as well. And I think one of the other reasons why there is so much resistance to the Super League at the moment is because of from being a fan, knowing what this will lead to. As I said, Liverpool have an official skincare sponsor, right? Like what? It doesn't make any sense. And yes, there are these talks of these hundreds of millions, if not billions, of cash injection going into these clubs as a result of them joining the Super League. But those are one-off payments. Well, how are those cash payments that are going to keep those clubs interested in the European Super League? How are they going to continue? And they're going to continue at the expense of fans. They're going to continue at the expense of extremely expensive broadcast deals, which we've seen already anyway. We know the trend. We know the trend has gone ridiculous in terms of broadcasting, and it will only get worse. Things like match tickets, for example. Match tickets for these European Super League games are not going to be cheap, and you're going to price out a huge number of fans. And I think we're extrapolating in our heads what will happen here. And I think that's where people are getting so emotional and so frustrated by this, because we know how it will end. We know where it will go, and ultimately it will be the fans of the sport, the people that tune in, week out, the people that are at the games, the people that are at home watching the games, that would ultimately lose out and end up paying extortionate amounts of money to support the club they love, support the club that their family have maybe followed, and support a club that has been part of their life and their family for so long. But taking the format of the European Super League actually in my opinion at least, isn't too radically different from what has currently been announced, or what has been announced as the updated Champions League format. So, you know, for example, when you look at that updated Champions League format, reading past the increase of number of teams to 36 and all things like this, there is an inclusion of 2 specific spots in the Champions League for teams that didn't qualify, but based on the UEFA coefficient, which again is something that never makes sense to anyone, but is basically based on your past performances and involvements in the competition. So you're almost guaranteeing the likes of a Liverpool, who this season, for example, may not qualify for the Champions League, a spot in that competition, given we won it last year, or given we won it 2 years ago, sorry. So we're seeing UEFA being so critical of this is hypocritical in many ways, which we'll talk about later. But this is, I think, one of the ways where UEFA was trending this way anyway, and the fact that it's just happened maybe more quickly than they would have liked it to, or at their expense, I think is the bit that they are really struggling with. So why has all this debate and talk about the European Super League come about? And I think we talked about it right at the beginning, right? The trend and history of football over the past 20 to 30 years. And we've seen that in the UK here in the Premier League. We've seen it in UEFA. We've seen it at FIFA, given the fact that the World Cup is going to be in Qatar. You know, that can only be driven by a financial motive. Qatar have never had any footballing history, are not set up as a country to even support and host a football tournament, let alone even a football match. And we've seen this trend towards more commercial football for a long time now. And I think UEFA and Premier League, what they are guilty of is not adapting their formats, their tournaments as the game has changed over the past years. There's been ample opportunity for those bodies to step in, either because of the best interests of football or the best interests of the fans or whatever, right? But they haven't. They've allowed it to materialize and change to get football to the stage where we're at, where what I'm saying is the European Super League is the admission of that commercial nature of what football is today. Now, don't get it twisted, right? As you said there about FIFA and Qatar, the same thing applies to UEFA as well. You know, given the fact that when Champions League tickets come out and the allocations get released every year, there is always, every single year, an uproar with the amount of tickets that are reserved and taken for corporates, right? And for, you know, friends of UEFA and all this other type of rubbish, right? That's only driven by one thing. That is driven by commercial, and it's driven by commerciality. So this has been a rifle for a long time, and the only reason that UEFA and Premier League are so aggy, the reason they're so aggy about this European Super League, is because now their pockets, their money that they have got so comfortable with for so long, is now under threat. And one of the things that I think, you know, we've seen a lot of uproar about this. We won't let the players play in, you know, competitions. Talks of things like that, I think, are also really damaging. And that's the second point as to why I think so much uproar has come about, is that both sides are really strong-arming each other. And it's a real problem. So let's take UEFA's stance, right? You know, talks of banning players from from competing in Euros and things like that. And then from the European Super League side, you know, we're going to withdraw all of the teams, and they're only going to play in this competition, and it's going to be run by these people, etc. With both parties acting so strong and dominant about this, it's just led to two heads butting, and that's what's led to such crazy talk from both sides. And I actually think it's led to some quite emotional decisions, particularly from UEFA's side. And I think, as I said, I think UEFA are purely rattled because their pockets are now the ones at risk. Don't get it twisted, guys. They're not rattled because, you know, they're worried about the future of football, or they're worried about how fans will, you know, continue to support football, etc. They are worried because their pocket is the one at risk now. And that is a really important part to play and to think about when you're considering your argument for why the European Super League might work or why it may not work. Now, as a fan in this situation as well, one of the things that I really struggle with, and I'm recording this on the day that Leeds play Liverpool, and I really feel sorry for these teams, because Liverpool and Leeds, both the players and the managers, are going to be quizzed on this, and inevitably they will have been briefed, not by the press of the club, probably by the press of the owners, to not say anything, and they're going to be in a very awkward position. But ultimately, the fans, the players, and the managers are all in the same boat here. You know, we've often been fans against players, and we've seen, you know, fan channels and all this type of stuff against players almost. But this time around, we all seem to be in the same boat, which is something very different. And ultimately, I think the fans will end up joining sides with the players, and I really don't think that boycotting is something that is far off the table. Players ultimately make the game, and if they do not play or do not want to play, there is nothing to see. And when there is nothing to see, everybody else disappears, be it from the commercials, be it from the broadcasters, everyone disappears. And I think when players realize that ultimately they may pay the price for their club's actions, I think that's when players will start to react. And don't forget, guys, there's unions and things like that as well, which will come into play and act as well to protect the players, because the players cannot and will not be made to suffer as a result of their club's actions. And which comes to the bit what I was saying about UEFA kind of strong-arming in this situation by saying we're going to pull our players. It is, yes, a way for them to go, you know what, you guys need to drop the European Super League, but is also very much a threat to the players as well. And I think that is really unfair, because it's very obvious, and I think no one's doubting at the moment, that the players and managers have had absolutely no say in what's going on with this Super League, and so to punish them, I think, is very tough. And I think it's UEFA are ultimately using both the fans and the players and the managers as a pawn in this game. And I think they really need to change that stance as well and focus on why the European Super League isn't right, rather than the perspective they're currently going on, which is, well, we own all of this, we hold all of this, and if you go over there, we will cut everything else, because I think that is the wrong way about going about it, and ultimately will lead to the wrong outcome for UEFA, for football, and for the fans. So overall, what do I think is going to happen next? So I think there's probably going to be three things that happen next. I think they will have lined up commercial sponsors. I think the European Super League, JP Morgan have one of the backers in terms of putting some money behind this competition, and there will be various commercial sponsors ready to go who will have been, like the European Super League were, testing the waters with this announcement. What is the reaction going to be? Now, I'm pretty sure many of them, if not all of them, will be very anxious based on what has transpired over the last 24 to 48 hours. And ultimately, with no commercial, as it is with players, if there's no players, there's no game. If there's no commercial sponsors, the money goes away and the whole argument and need for the European Super League disappears. And I think that is a real risk, and that is a real risk why I think ultimately the European Super League won't happen. The next one is the players and managers. We talked about it just then. I think with the help of their unions, if UEFA continue to either threaten or say that the players won't be able to play in certain competitions, or they'll be kicked out of certain things, that ultimately they will react and boycott, and both with the fans ultimately force the hand of the clubs to make a decision ultimately that won't be in the favour of going to a European Super League. And so what do I think finally will happen, right? So I think the clubs will ultimately not go to a European Super League. I think what will happen ultimately is that the clubs will go, look, we're not going to go. We've heard what the fans have to say, right? And whether or not you believe this is another thing, but I think ultimately they'll come back and say, look, we've seen the response, we've heard the fans, we've heard, the players, and ultimately we don't think it's the right thing to do. However, we've noticed these issues with the way UEFA, FIFA, Premier League, etc. are run, and we demand change. And they will ultimately force change beyond what's already been announced by UEFA for the Champions League, for example, and anything the Premier League or any of the other major leagues were planning. And I think that's ultimately what will happen, and those teams will force change in their own leagues and in the existing structure rather than breaking away, because I think the risk of breaking away in terms of setting up something completely new like this, with the huge risks and everything that has been announced so far, ultimately will be too big of a risk for both the teams, the players, the owners, etc. And so that's why I think ultimately this will be a big exercise in testing UEFA, the Premier League, the Serie A, etc., on how willing they are to change and listen to those bigger clubs, which is one of the reasons why the bigger clubs got into this in the first place. They don't feel like they were being listened to, and I think ultimately that's what it will end up doing. But that's it for this video, guys. It was a weird one. Sorry if it was a bit out all over the place. I've been trying to just gather my thoughts and reading about this as much as I can today, and I'm sure I'll continue to read more and learn more as well. But let me know in the comments, guys, what you guys think of it. I'd love to hear your opinion as well. Maybe we can have a conversation in the comments about it. But yeah, as I said, ultimately I don't think it will happen, but it spawned a debate in football, right? And that's what we need. We can't stay in the structures we're in without ever questioning them. And I think the fact that in the media and stuff, I've seen a kind of a unanimous condemnation of it, I think is wrong, because we need to have a debate about what possibly are the pros of this, and what the pros and how we can maybe take some of those pros and bring them into our existing structures, rather than just unanimously go, no, we're not going to do this. But yeah, as I said, guys, let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say. And yeah, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Peace.